Good evening, everybody. I am Jackie Terraza. For those who don't know me, I'm the Carolyn Mussey Director at the Colby College Museum of Art, and it is just fantastic to celebrate with all of you from near and afar the opening of The World Outside, Louise Nevelson at Midcentury. And as we begin, I acknowledge that I speak from the homelands of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which is currently comprised of 5 nations: the Abenaki, the Maliseet, the Mi'kmaq, the Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy peoples. It is in these homelands that Louise Nevelson arrived at age 6 from Ukraine, establishing a life along with her family in what we now call Rockland, Maine. And it was in the early days of the 20th century that this happened. In the decades that followed, she became one of the most important artists of her day and one of the most influential to this day. And you will learn a lot more about her during the course of this program. So fast forward to now, about 4 weeks ago, or fewer than that, 4 tractor trailers arrived at the Colby Museum carrying enormous crates. Our terrific team of art preparators and collections and registration staff began the slow process of carefully unloading, uncrating, moving, and installing Louise Nevelson's spectacular sculptures, her prints, her paintings, and also drawings in our newly refurbished Jetty galleries. Couriers from museums across the United States and from Europe, along with our counterparts at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, made their way to Colby here in Waterville, Maine, to accompany the sculptures and ensure their safety. And as a result, we have an absolutely spellbinding and revelatory exhibition. At the Colby Museum, exhibitions do good work. They are the basis of teaching, of learning, of enjoyment for the benefit of Colby students, staff, and faculty, local and regional residents, and those coming from much farther away to visit our galleries. And I'm very grateful to Beth Finch, our head curator, for proposing that we bring this ambitious project to Maine from the Amon Carter Museum in Texas, making the Colby Museum one of only 2 places where audiences can see this amazing exhibition firsthand. I thank our colleagues at the Amon Carter Museum, especially their director, Andrew Walker, and exhibition curator, Shirley Reece-Hughes, for organizing the project. And I believe that Maria Nelson may be here in our audience. If so, hello. And she is a designer and sculptor, as well as the artist's granddaughter, and the person who established the Louise Nevelson Foundation. Maria wrote a wonderful reflection for the catalog, and I thank her for her partnership as well. My sincere appreciation for all of the staff, contractors, couriers, partners who work for and with the museum, and who have made this exhibition and will make the related programs happen. There isn't a single staff at the museum who is not in some way involved in our exhibitions, from those installing the art, to those processing loan agreements, to those making payments of the bills, to staff in communications and advancement, to those planning programs and complex installation plans. So thank you to all of you. I also acknowledge Pace Gallery and Arnie Glimcher, who have represented Nevelson and championed her work from the start. The substantial holdings of Nevelson's work at the Amon Carter Museum and the Colby Museum are much expanded by an impressive group of loans from over 25 lenders, and I thank them for trusting us with their artworks, which they have made available to us. Generous support for the exhibition comes from the Coletta A. Doolin Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. And funding for the Colby Museum's presentation is provided by the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, Bob and Cynthia McDonald, the Luella and Nicholas Martin Charitable Fund, Heidi Irving Naughton and Kevin Naughton, and also Lucy Rame. I acknowledge the support from the 25th Anniversary Fund, the Edward H. Turner Art Exhibition Fund, the Joseph B. and Catherine R. Drummond Fund, and the Everett and Florence Turner Exhibition Fund. Finally, I thank President Green, our Museum Board of Governors, college trustees, and all of you, our friends of art, for championing the museum and making possible programs such as tonight's. So now I'm going to turn things over to our wonderful panelists who will arrive on screen, and I will rejoin you in the audience to enjoy this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, and good evening, everyone. I am Beth Finch, and as head curator of the Colby Museum, I will be facilitating tonight's conversation. Before we get underway, I want to point out the captions feature, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. In addition, this program is being recorded and will be available in about a week on the Colby Museum's website, so should you want to revisit it or share it with others. As Jackie mentioned, we are joined this evening by Shirley Reece-Hughes, curator of painting, sculpture, and works on paper at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, and the curator of The World Outside, Louise Nevelson at Midcentury. We are also joined by Jaime deSimone, chief curator of the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine. In the interest of time saving, the speakers' bios have been added or will be added to the chat feature. Art And is an event series that brings together invited guests for conversations about exhibitions, collections, and projects at the Colby Museum and its Lunder Institute for American Art. Tonight's conversation considers Louise Nevelson in Maine. With the arrival of the Carter Museum's exhibition at Colby, there are many more Nevelson artworks in Maine, nearly 70, in fact. But these visiting artworks are not alone, because late in life, the artist ensured that Maine became a significant repository of her work, with gifts to Colby, the Farnsworth, and other institutions. In fact, 3 Maine institutions, the Farnsworth, Colby, and the University of New England, were a source of loans for the Carter Museum's exhibition. The gifts Nevelson gave to Maine were made in recognition of her and her family's ties to the Pine Tree State. In the early 20th century, as Jackie mentioned, the Berlasky family immigrated to Maine from what is now Ukraine and was then under the control of the Russian Empire. Given Maine is rich in Nevelson's history and artworks, and because Colby is the second and last venue of the Carter Museum's exhibition, the only venue on the East Coast, we will approach tonight's topic from 2 angles, learning about the exhibition that is here in our galleries from Shirley Reece-Hughes, who will speak first, and then shifting to Jaime deSimone's reflections on Nevelson's ties to Rockland. After that, I will offer a few more Maine-focused reflections on Nevelson, Colby, and the Skowhegan School specifically. We will then have a brief conversation together before transitioning to audience questions. So please use the Q&A feature to add your question, and we will very much try to get to it. With that, Jaime and I will leave the screen and turn things over to Shirley. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you all so much. I want to express my deepest thanks to the director of the Colby College Museum of Art, Jacqueline Terrassa, and head curator Elizabeth Finch for their partnership in bringing The World Outside, Louise Nevelson at Midcentury, to the Colby, and for the invitation to speak this evening. I'm delighted to share the exhibition with you and give you a little background on the show. So with that, I thought I'd briefly talk about the show. And one of the questions I receive is, why do an exhibition on Louise Nevelson now? And one of the reasons is that Nevelson we have deep holdings of Nevelson in our collection. And one of the goals of Carter Curators has been to try to bring new insights into American creativity based on the museum collection. And I was so lucky because the Carter started collecting her work in depth in the 1960s with a full set of her 1967 lithographs that she did at the Tamarind Art Institute, and even some of the early 1963 ones, and then major sculptures from different periods of Nevelson's career: an early 1930s plaster sculpture, a 1940s ceramic work, and then one of her 1950s, what she's known for, wooden assemblage works entitled Lunar Landscape. So that was one of the, having all of this wonderful wealth of material around me was really inspiring. And I found it fascinating that Nevelson, no matter what media she was working in, she just was curious about it and experimenting and trying something new that other artists had not explored. So, one of the issues with Nevelson was during her lifetime, she was sort of portrayed as this isolated recluse. As you've heard, she was born Leah Berlowski, a Jewish immigrant who left Ukraine to escape religious persecution, and she settled with her family in Rockland, Maine about 1905. By 1931, she had married, had one child, and separated from her husband, Charles Nevelson, to pursue an artistic career. As a young Jewish Ukrainian immigrant working during the male dominated art world of the mid 20th century, Nevelson had to overcome many obstacles. In the 1950s, when she was first earning renown, and you see on the left side of your screen this Life magazine portrayal, a coverage of one of Nevelson's first landmark installations called Moon Garden Plus One. And you see the title there, the weird woodwork of Louise Nevelson. And so their critics often kind of described her as, this isolated genius. And you see here, she's kind of partaking in this, this mythology. She's donned a witch's hat. She looks rather green. She's performing. And part of this it's really difficult to imagine what it must have been like for women artists, especially women who were not supposed to be sculptors. But as you can see on the right, one of Nevelson's gifts was cultivating a very unique image, flamboyant even, with her multiple sets of eyelashes, bandanas, gestures. But we have to understand, too, that was a way for her to earn recognition at a time when it was almost impossible for women to get any recognition for sculpture. So one of the things that I found, important was not only to take a deeper dive into Nevelson, and because she was portrayed in her early career as this isolated genius, like how engaged she was with the world outside, and that's a phrase that she used. She really was engaged with what was happening, and her legacy was so important. And I brought up some contemporary artists working today who talk about Nevelson's legacy. She was really a pioneer of site-specific installations that she often doesn't get credit for. And she was also one of the first artists to think about viewers' participation in the work. And these artists you see here, Leonardo Drew, Tara Donovan, Shakaya Booker, Jean Shin, are all artists who talk about Nevelson as a vital forerunner to their own work. Her salvaging of found wooden objects really expanded the meaning of everyday castaway materials and drew our awareness to our surroundings. And so artists like these, often their works at times allude to or evoke environmental issues related to climate change. Both Tara Donovan and Jean Shin wrote for the catalog. And I just want to give you a quick quote by Jean Shin, whose title for the essay was A World Within, a Universe Beyond. In our, excuse me, in our penchant for what is sorry, cast off, Nevelson, I'm sorry, and I are kindred spirits, rescuing and repurposing society's discards. As a creative practice, is a choice to participate in a regenerative cycle. I'm so sorry, I got a tickle in my throat. So Nevelson is best known for her signature wall works. And what she was defying was this World War II, as you see artists working in metal. And you see that David Smith there that's at the Colby. And so she's working with her hands in a different way while they're really exploring linearity with metal constructions. So at Midcentury, she's upending these ideas by working with her hands. So she's repurposing non-art materials that she'd cut and then dip into a can of black Rust-Oleum matte black, which is still available at Home Depot today. And then she would configure these pieces into crates. So The exhibition looks at how Nevelson arrived at these crates, or wall assemblages, starting with the choreographer, which Nevelson had started almost 20-year study of modern dance. And it wasn't that she planned to be a professional dancer, it's that it shaped her art making because she was so interested in the bodily form. And you see the Colby drawing on the left, like her drawings were even radical for the time. You know, instead of that classical figure drawing, the figures are expanded, almost bursting within the seams. And Martha Graham was a really important influence for her. And you see that she went to many of her performances. So you see what Martha Graham did was try to take the everyday. She did this performance, Lamentation, literally seated the entire time. And then in the middle, this is Nevelson's homage to Martha Graham that the Farnsworth was kind to lend. And it's in bronze. So it's, you know, it shows that Nevelson really worked through every medium early in her career to arrive at her wooden assemblages. The other thing that really influenced her work was in 1950 and 51. Nevelson traveled to Mexico and Guatemala, where her encounters with Maya art and excavation sites would shape her visual language. So Nevelson was studying printmaking at the Atelier studio, and you see those etchings at the bottom that are in the show. So that kind of removing and cutting away of the print in the black and coming out of the black and the shadows really inspired her to work in a different mode. And you see that in that small box in the top of the right screen, where she's literally taken found wooden objects and combined them. So if you look at the Mayan sculpture on the left, you see the kind of resonance, that shallow relief that perhaps inspired her. The visionary section of the show looks at the idea of how Nevelson was a pioneer. And part of that is that this is the exhibition I talked about earlier, Moon Garden +1, where she was one of the first artists to do this full-scale immersive installation. She lit the gallery in blue lights so that people felt like they were moving into an entirely different environment. And this was critical because no one else had really done this yet, not in America. And she said the one in that title, Moon Garden +1, the one represented the viewer. So this is where she's thinking about viewers' participation. And she was very attuned to the times of day. She was also interested in the space age, which ran from about the 1950s to the 1970s, just interested in this new planetary consciousness. And you often see her sculptures are titled Moon, Lunar, Night, Sky Chapel, Sky Cathedral. So reflecting almost her sense of contemplating humankind's place in the cosmos. So Nevelson had turned to found objects as her primary medium during World War II. This is when collecting, salvaging, and stacking materials was part of daily life. In 1942, the United States government began a rationing system, starting with tires and then put purchasing limits on sugar. You see in the left-hand side, the community coming together, standing in line for sugar rationing. And then the Salvage for Victory campaign, if you see the poster in the upper right, this idea of we need to save metals and papers, and you see the boys stacking. So all of this was part of Nevelson was experiencing. Her son was also in the Merchant Marine. So this whole idea of gathering materials, stacking, and supplying them was in the hopes that it could bring soldiers home sooner. So what you see in that upper left, that was an original installation she did in 1959 called Dawn's Wedding Feast. What's fascinating about this is she said she thought of it as recalling the stately colonial houses in Rockland, Maine, where she grew up and felt like an outsider as a Jewish immigrant. For Dawn's Wedding Feast, the artist reportedly went home to Rockland and sourced some of the wood, reclaiming her past and inverting it, and then creating it, putting it into this sculptural installation, Dawn's Wedding Feast, that was really a celebration of community, the idea of marriage, but also community. And then in the printmaker section, I think it's Nevelson was one of the first. There she is in 1963 working. That's the first time she went. She was one of the first artists incorporating fabric. So if you look at that print on the right, she's actually taken in this white doily. So it's almost a symbol for the fragility, supposedly fragility of needlework, and made it a very bold image. And she, at that point, she'd made a larger set of tamarin prints than anyone had. So she kept experimenting. It also reflected her interest in space. In 1959, NASA's Explorer 6 broadcast the first televised pictures from outer space, including in the middle, the first image of the Earth taken from an extraterrestrial vantage. And this bears kind of an uncanny resemblance to the print on the left that Nevelson created at Tamarin. On the right, you see another work she did, and it's almost like looking through a telescope at these moons, or, suggest portals, and they're very velvety black. And this sort of flickering of light and dark would translate into a series she called Atmosphere and Environment. So the environmentalist section kind of looks at how Nevelson was immersed in this time period when we think of the detonation of the atomic bombs, and that really brought forth the science of ecology had been around for hundreds of years, but they were calling it the new science of ecology because it was suddenly this understanding, or this really embrace and examination of what humans do to impact the earth. So at the same time that's happening, and there's more of an understanding, the term environment, as we understand it today, became part of the American vernacular in 1956. So this understanding of the complex physical, chemical, and biotic factors, such as climate and soil, and how that affects living things. This was now becoming a part of the American understanding. At the same time, you have this rise of economic growth and capitalism and abundance. So you see on the picture on the right, Family Utopia, 1946 scene, stating, they said in Life magazine, this was statistics of consumer demand. So the demand for suburban homes, appliances, cars, TVs, and all of that. So there's Nevelson going out and taking all this disposed wood in the 40s and 50s that's attuning her to the excessive production of material and waste that became part of the American system. So in part, painting that Americans discarded debris gold and placing it in receptacles, as you see on this work on the left. In some ways, people talked about it as, oh, she's looking at royalty and opulence, but she's also questioning materialism. She talked a lot about people being greedy and having too much. There's also the story that she reportedly came to Texas to meet with a gallerist, dealer named Dord Fitz, who represented her, and said that she saw golden handles in bathrooms and saw the gaudiness of Texas. So I believe that, coming from the state, that inspired her. But she's also, I just want to, as I'm wrapping up here, look at the way she was thinking about the earth, and almost like the contemplation of underpinning all of life, this really large scale wall mounted sculpture. It also reflects that she kept changing her mode. She didn't simply do walls, she moved into wall mounted works. And, this picture of William Anders' Earthrise that so many people see. And this is almost like a snapshot of the earth when you have a chance, hopefully, to stand in front of it and see Night's Ag Wall on the left. And then finally, her Atmosphere and Environment series that she did outdoors, made from Corten steel. This idea of shaping the earth was really, at part of what she'd been thinking about all along, about that abstract references to the earth and pulling them outside. But you can see as early as 1958, she's shaping the sunlight as it comes in. And her influence was critical for artists like Nancy Holt, who was an earth artist, and her sun tunnels that she did in 1976. So I think the exhibition explores and reveals all of Nevelson's curiosity and endless sort of exploration of different forms. And I'm so happy now at this point to turn the presentation now over to Jaime deSimone, and let her talk about Nevelson in Maine.
Thank you so much, Shirley, and congratulations to you and everyone at the Amon Carter and Colby College for hosting this exhibition. I just need access to share my screen.
I need to stop sharing.
Oh, here we go. So I am going to bring people way back and really contextualize and just a few brief moments so that we can stay on schedule. Louise Nevelson in Rockland, Maine, starting with her childhood. And this is a very early drawing dating from around 1905. And the reason I'm showing you this is to think about the community in which Nevelson began showing early signs of her artistic practice. And drawing was also illustrated in Shirley's presentation, and you can see how her figures evolved from the stick figures that are here in this drawing to her more voluptuous, full-formed figures. But this is just indicative of how she was coming into her own. And equally important are some anecdotal comments that Louise Nevelson would make over the years with some of her biographers. And, you know, she always had these comments about what led her to art, and one of them being that she was always given 100+ in art. So of course, that is where she would continue to practice. But on a more serious note, it is believed that at the Rockland Public Library was one of the first places she was introduced to sculpture. And it was an example of what you're seeing here, this plastic figure of Joan of Arc, which at that time, Nevelson was around 9 years old. And this was one of those reproduced plaster casts that were created in abundance at those times and were produced in America and Europe around the turn of the 20th century. And so here she would have seen this type of sculpture and perhaps been curious about it. And Nevelson also shared at one point in an interview that as a child and perhaps around the time of visiting with this sculpture, she was asked by the librarian in conversation with a friend what they wanted to be when they were going to grow up. And at first she answered that she was going to be an artist very quick-wittedly, and then changed her mind and said, no, I want to be a sculptor and I don't want color to help me. And she went on to recount that that thought of being a sculptor confused her and upset her, and she ran home crying because she didn't really understand how she could articulate that. And I think looking back, we take all of Nevelson's comments with a little bit of grain of salt, but of course we know she did go on to be one of the most pioneering sculptors of her time, working in black, gold, and white. What you're seeing here is the very first acquisition by Louise Nevelson to come into the Farnsworth collection in 1955. This is a work called Brown's Bird, and this was presented to the museum by Harold Weston, who was then president of the Federation of Modern Painters and Sculptors, which Nevelson was then a member of, and he reached out to the then director of the Farnsworth Art Museum, Wendell Hadlock, and in normal correspondence said to him, she's one of living artists with a national reputation, though born elsewhere, considers Rockland as part of her origin, and it would seem most suitable for Louise Nevelson to be represented in your museum. So Hadlock and the committee and Weston continued on in their correspondence, and ultimately Bronze Bird became part of the Farnsworth collection in 1955. So you can see here, it's a very early sculpture, reminiscent of those that reference animals and figures, semi-abstract, also showcasing forms of primitive art or cubism. In the 50s, the late 50s in particular, not only were important because of this acquisition, which came in only 7 years after the museum opened in 1948, but Louise Nevelson's brother and his wife Her brother Nathan owned the historic Sword Dyke Hotel in downtown Rockland. So you're seeing a picture of that here. And he was one of her biggest supporters and admirers, and regularly showcased Nevelson's work in the lobby. So you can still talk to people in the mid-coast of Maine today who have memories of going to the hotel and seeing Nevelson's work throughout the hotel. And what you're seeing on the right side of the screen is a picture of Louise Nevelson's son, Mike Nevelson, installing one of her earliest wall box sculptures, Sky Cathedral. And Sky Cathedral was a pivotal moment in her career when she began working in architectural space, mounting sculptures to walls and ceilings to create what she called and termed, quote unquote, worldscapes. What is so interesting to me is that Sky Cathedral hung at the Thorndike Hotel for 10 years until it was acquired by the pioneering collectors of American sculpture, Jean and Howard Lipman, and it is now in the San Jose Museum of Art collection. So I love the idea of transporting yourself to the late 50s when you could just walk into a hotel in downtown Rockland and be immersed in a world of Nevelson. Another important decade for Louise Nevelson, which was another homecoming of sorts, were the 1970s. You're seeing here a picture of her with another fellow artist, Andrew Wyeth. This is taking place in 1974 when she returns home, and this is a quote from the Maine Telegram saying that she was chauffeured in a limousine from New York. So showing up in style to attend the unveiling and celebration of a dining room named in her honor at the Thorndike Hotel. So there was a Nevelson room opened at her brother's hotel, and so she returned for the event to celebrate with her family and other representatives of the Maine community. That was in '74. 2 years later, she is invited by Maurice Pelledo, who was the Farnsworth Art Museum's third director, to start thinking about an exhibition that would eventually take place at the museum in 1979 called The Art of Louise Nevelson. You're seeing some installation shots of the exhibition here, and on the far right, some of these white columns are remnants of the Don column installation that Shirley showed from its original larger installation at the Museum of Modern Art. And this was a really big affair to have her come home. It was marked the Nevelson year by the museum. These are pages from the annual report. You can see lots of pictures of press conferences, people following her around town. There, of course, was a multiple day opening, a champagne gala, a members luncheon. Over the 2.5 month exhibition, over 20,000 people came to see the show, which we believe at that time was unprecedented in the 70s. There was also, what you're seeing here is a still image of an interview with CBS Sunday morning program with the anchor is Charles Osgood. That if you'd like to go watch it, it is still available on YouTube, and this aired locally as well as internationally on French and Swiss televisions, and CBS, their newscasters followed her around town for 4 days and filmed at various locations at the Farnsworth, including this scene you're seeing here. At one time, an art critic and lots of press said it was the most exciting cultural event Maine had experienced in the last 2 decades. And I don't know how Louise Nevelson felt about this wonderful part of one of these events, but then Rockland's mayor, Warren Perry, read a resolution that was passed by the city council proclaiming July 3rd Louise Nevelson Day. And this picture that you're seeing here marks that occasion and giving her a, quote, key to the city. And that key was actually a lobster measuring gauge, which was very fitting for Rockland's title being the lobster capital of the world. So here she is receiving that designation with, on the right, the director of the Farnsworth Art Museum, Maurice Pelledo at the time. There was a lot of significant outcomes as well related to the exhibition, and that is really attributed to Nevelson herself and her family and son. And they had the foresight to think about forming the Louise Nevelson Archives at the Farnsworth Art Museum. And so thanks to gifts from her brother Nathan and her son Mike, as well as her sister, they all, throughout the course of her career, saved newspaper clippings, photographs, archival material. Even Nevelson herself donated significant correspondence over the years to the museum. So this really cemented the Farnsworth as a repository for scholarship on Nevelson. And that was something she felt was really important at the time after the warm reception she had received on the occasion of her exhibition in '79. I'm going to stop there and say also more recently in 2018, the Farnsworth went on to donate the Louise Nevelson Archives to the Archives of American Art, recognizing that the Archives of American Art are their most world's preeminent research center in our country, and they're dedicated to scholarship and preservation and collections. So if anyone is interested in accessing those materials, they are now at the Archives of American Art. And last but not least, we have currently reinstalled our Nevelson collection thanks to the tremendous curatorial efforts of Suzette McAvoy, who guest curated this show for the Farnsworth Art Museum. And what you're seeing here is an installation shot that introduces the show with Nevelson's signature. And this is important because also in the 80s, in addition to forming the Nevelson Archives, Nevelson donated 87 pieces of art to the museum, including 56 of her own works and another 31 by other artists. Her brother and sister went on to make other significant gifts to the museum. And so today, the Farnsworth is the second largest collection of Nevelson's work in the United States after the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. And what is unique about the Farnsworth collection, as you can see in some of the installation shots in the current show, Louise Nevelson, Dawn to Dusk, is that we do have a chronological survey of her works and a significant holding of early works and paintings from when she was a student. So for all of you who are going to flock to Maine to see the Amon Carter show, I would also encourage you to come over to the Mid-Coast to see a different perspective of Louise Nevelson at the Farnsworth. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jaime. So I'd like to begin my reflection on Nevelson in Maine via the view from the podium of the New York Hilton at Rockefeller Center. It was from this vantage point that Nevelson accepted the inaugural prize in sculpture from Maine's Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. And this was on April 27 of 1971. The invitation came from Bill Cummings, an artist and one of the founders of the school. Nevelson offered her acceptance remarks in the presence of art world luminaries. Seated to her left is a rapt J. Carter Brown, director of the National Gallery. Nevelson had never visited the school associated with Skowhegan, Maine, but that celebratory evening inspired her to embrace the connection. "This gives me twice the pleasure," she proclaimed, "because I come from Maine." This is a Berlosky family in circa 1907 when they were in Rockland. The future artist is standing on the right wearing what appears to be a heart-shaped pendant. Nevelson's skills at accessorizing began early. When Nevelson began speaking publicly about her Maine roots in the early 1970s, in part inspired by the invitation of the Skowhegan School, it is fair to say that she was close to her family there, but somewhat estranged from the place itself. As she began returning to Maine, she also began describing the discrimination she and her family had faced as Jewish immigrants to Maine. Nevelson had things to say, and she was seeking connection to and recognition from Maine's arts institutions. How was this mix of feelings expressed? I would say through tremendous generosity and a desire to demonstrate the power of creativity as a transformative force, both personal and social. This slide shows Nevelson on the Skowhegan campus. She was visiting faculty. She was a faculty member at the school in 1972 and 78. She served on both the Board of Governors and Trustees for various years from that time until her death in 1988. And she also lectured twice at the school. In both of these photos, she's the figure on the left. And here is Nevelson at the Colby Museum in the fall of 1973, looking characteristically elegant. Please note, and it will be relevant later, the gray wall-to-wall carpet she is standing on. Nevelson's emerging association with Skowhegan led to an organic connection to Colby, as the two institutions have shared ties from their founding to the present day. In 1973, when the Colby Museum inaugurated the Edith and Ellerton Jetty galleries, which you see here on that day of their inauguration, the Nevelson, and that is where the Nevelson exhibition is now installed. Nevelson gave the Colby Museum many works, about 30, in various mediums. She also spoke that day, and I'd like to share a few of her words from the transcript. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, and Governor, and all of the other distinguished people, I'm going to do something I didn't plan on. I'm going to do it like a movie and go from a rerun, so as not to forget a few things. And that is to establish the fact that I didn't plan to come to Maine under these circumstances. And if it hadn't been for the friendship of your curator, Hugh Gorley, and Bill Cummings, I probably wouldn't be here today. But friendship, I think, somehow surpasses almost everything. She went on to say, so I would like to say, and to tie up a bit with this splendor, what I want to say is the importance of, to each living being, what creativity is and how it penetrates every pore of our livingness, and also to emphasize that a museum is not just a building. It's a very living, wonderful thing. The Maine Sunday Telegram summarized in a headline that read, Museum, living, breathing thing, sculptress tells group at Colby. 2 years later, she received an honorary doctorate from Colby College with her friend Betty Davis by her side, also receiving that honor. Betty Davis has ties to Maine as well, including having been a lifeguard in Ogunquit in the 20s. So the Colby exhibition, how does it acknowledge Nevelson and Maine? And I think in the ways it does, it's has some distinctions from the Carter's presentation. Our lobby has contextual works, including the painting on the right by Bill Cummings of Betty Davis. And the exhibition itself, so within the galleries, has been supplemented by additional works that Nevelson gave to Colby College, including the standing figure, which you may have spied when you saw the image of Nevelson in our galleries. It's been situated on a large base in the gallery that evokes the one that stood there in 1973. It's essentially in that same spot, which has been really wonderful to do. In an added section, we've also added a section called the Art World Royal from Rockland, based on a headline that ran in a Maine newspaper at the time of Nevelson's death. And this includes letters from Hugh Gorley and Bill Cummings to Nevelson, photographs and so forth. And nearby in an area is an area of painted wood shapes made by local woodworker Evan Lovejoy that can be arranged in homage to Nevelson. They were certainly inspired by Nevelson. So this is a sneak peek of the exhibition that opens tomorrow. We're thrilled to have this beautiful work, Rainforest Wall, coming from visiting from Rotterdam, and I might just notice there the wood floors, which are accompanying this exhibition and our newly renovated galleries. And this is from this morning, when the staff, part of our staff meeting was in the galleries, and we got to enjoy it together. And I can't thank the folks in this image and all of the museum staff and security more for all their work they've been doing to create this exhibition, and to the staff at the Amon Carter and Shirley for bringing this exhibition, helping us bring this exhibition to Colby. So I'm going to stop there, stop sharing. And Shirley and Jaime, if you could join me on screen. Thank you so much. We have a few minutes, and we will also be shifting to questions from the audience. But I guess I wanted to start our conversation, and thank you both for your presentations, to receive that background from you, Shirley, on what this exhibition is and how you brought it all together is really, really wonderful. And it's been wonderful to find, begin with the choreographer section in our exhibition. And then upstairs we have the visionary and the environmentalist. All of those topics will, I think, be very relevant to Colby classes this semester. We're really thrilled. Students are now back on campus to share this exhibition with them and with faculty, and obviously our community as well. And then downstairs in the galleries is the community builder and the printmaker, and then that additional section I mentioned related to some of the ephemera we've gathered for this project. But I guess I wanted to ask you both, where do you see Maine in Nevelson's art?
I was going to let Jaime answer that. I've been to Maine, but my Texas reference is the gold. So I'm going to let Jaime answer that. I'm sure she has much more insights than I do.
Oh no, surely. That's a great question. It's funny because in a lot of conversations with artists, and knowing that, she never had a studio here except for practicing at Skowhegan or being a faculty member there. I like to imagine she would never say my art is Maine art. She would divorce herself from any inclination of that. She was very much looking to escape, and but one might suggest there's some memory of nature or environment or beauty and magnitude and currents and energy that she might have consumed as both a young person and a returning adult, that perhaps subconsciously informed her sculptures just as much as her urbanscapes and being in a New York environment.
Yeah. I've worked with an artist who came from Maine, and now she's a professor in Texas, and she talked a lot about the woods and that experience of it. And I think there's probably that obvious connection of the family being involved in lumber and then having the woodscape, and and of course she said she never really loved wood, and if she did love wood, why would she paint it? But I loved your idea about energy and the probably the landscape. I think I can speak to how a landscape affects you. I mean, growing up in Texas with the flat horizon line and the sun and the light, that's kind of become like I think about it a lot. It's influenced me. So I'm sure her roots and growing up in Maine, in fact, impacted her in some way. Do you think, Beth, there's something, do you see more Maine connections in her art than I'm seeing, obviously?
I do, Shirley. So when I have to say, this has been one of those, I thought I knew Nevelson, and what's exciting about this exhibition, and as it arrived here, and the kind of intimate looking that you do at it, something when objects are emerging and you're arranging them in the galleries, I really did feel a palpable sense that some of the objects came from Maine, and I guess we understand that at least Dawn's Wedding Feast and some of those elements, but and then there's the ways that they invoke New England architecture, that's certainly there. But the other thing I really am feeling in the galleries is this connection to folk art. And, Maine has a wonderful history through artists like Hamilton Easterfield, who had an artist residency in the Ogunquit area, and had a real interest between making a connection between folk art and modernism. So Nevelson was emerging on the scene a little later than that, I'd say about a generation later than that, give or take. But that palpable sense of the kind of hand wrought and the self-taught and the learn by doing, and what one can make in a hard day's work feels very relevant to this place. So that kind of that has been more of a sort of presence that I think has emerged as we've installed this exhibition. I'm curious as well, and we'll then segue perhaps to the audience's questions for us. But I'm curious, Jaime. There's such a vibrant, and you work so closely with contemporary artists in Maine. Do you find at the Farnsworth that Nevelson is a real pilgrimage site for the many artists who live and work here?
Oh, absolutely. I think since we reinstalled that collection a year and a half ago now, it's one of, it's a fixture at the museum that artists can return to and see examples of. And one example on the very tip of my tongue is I have this very vivid memory of the painter Anne Craven sending me a text message saying, I'm in the Louise Nevelson gallery. I'm looking at her paintings, a painter looking at a painter. Can you come see me and talk to me about what I'm seeing? And I was like, yes, of course. How remarkable to be able to have this engagement. And in a lot of Nevelson's paintings, she paints these red stars. And this was something that Anne Craven was really interested in. And so in a body of work that Anne did, I guess in 2022, you see these stars appearing. And it is all because she was fascinated by what Nevelson was doing, and was doing close looking in the galleries and was taking a nod to her.
That's really, really wonderful. And there's a painting in addition to the Carter exhibition, and the Colby presentation is a painting called Maine Meadows, and it has some of those stars in it as well, which was, you begin to see them in other places as soon as you start to look. There's something she really liked to do. We've had a question about what kind of multidisciplinary courses and coursework classes will be offered with the exhibition that Colby students will be part of. And I know that there's an anthropology course called Afterlives, Social Worlds of Wastes and Discards that will be visiting the exhibition, and also an environmental studies class called Global Change Ecology. And of course, we're very much hoping there's a very active printmaking studio practice here at Colby, and that too, and I would say in Waterville, we have, it's a wonderful place for printmakers. So we anticipate that will also be significant and important. And that was another revelation for me, Shirley, in your exhibition when I saw it in August at the Carter when it opened, was just the presence of those prints is truly, just the physicality of them is you really have to see them in person.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I'm looking to see if we have other questions. Oh, we actually have a question from a printmaker here in Waterville, as Elizabeth Jabbar, and also part of the Colby staff. Elizabeth is asking, can you speak to the connections/conversation you see between the prints and the sculpture?
Mm.
Shirley, do you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I think part of it is she was interested in incorporating materials like lace and doilies and fabric into these works. So that whole idea of incorporating everyday materials and then having them transcend sort of their ordinary functions. Like in the 1967 prints, which I didn't really focus on, she uses cheesecloth and she placed it on the lithographic stone. And if you look at the prints, honestly, it looks like the cheesecloth is there and it's not. It is literally just the imprint and the texture. So I think that whole sense, Nevelson was really also at the forefront of thinking about touch and haptic experience with her sculptures. And I think she translated that into her printmaking as well. Do you all have other thoughts on that?
I think that really captures it. I think what am struck by is just the way she layered and also the way she worked with paper. So paper that you think is square was actually cut and assembled, and so it has that physicality. You're speaking of that kind of haptic, but also tactile.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and also the way she thought in terms of grids, which certainly relates. Yeah,
Absolutely.
We have a question related to the color black.
Mm.
So why did Nevelson paint the wood black? Is there meaning behind that choice in so many of her pieces?
So I think in part, and she talked about it, she talked about black a lot as containing all color. And so to her, it had this sense of power, I think, an accessibility that, and it helped transform. Obviously, she could unify her sculptures by using one monochromatic matte color. And we see her moving into white, which she did in 1959, and then gold around 1960. But she doesn't stick as long with white. I mean, there's obviously, she had a long career working up until almost her death in 1988. She did go back and use white and use gold much less. But I think for black, one of the things was Nevelson wanted to create that sense of shadow. She really wanted to play with that. She thought of it as something concrete. And so like by having the black, if you, when hopefully you get a chance to see like those boxes, like it creates a different shadow. And at the same time, it creates like a uniformity. So you have this, I think it's this fascinating duality between kind of all these varied parts that are nestled into boxes and creating shadows. And at the same time, you step back and then you see all this sort of uniform. So I think it was a really, it really, I think it worked to her advantage. She worked mostly in black. And I think most of her, I would say her black sculptures are typically, you know, more successful. The white showed more of the flaws of the wood, which sometimes I think, you know, she wasn't afraid not to show. But I think white was just in some ways maybe a little more difficult too. So.
We have a couple more questions, and then I think we'll call it an evening. We have an attendee asking us to speak about the significance of her work with found wood objects versus carved ones. Would either of you like to speak to that, Jaime, or?
I mean, I'm more familiar with the found objects more than the carving thing. So I was always under the impression that she was assembling from found pieces and very little manipulation or carving was coming into play. But surely you would know better than I here.
I think like we have in our galleries, we have like Robert Laurent, as you were talking about, he was a collector of folk art. I think that, by the way, that folk art connection is really fascinating. I think there's something there. And so he would like that direct carving process he brought back, and so did William Zorak, you know, in that a generation earlier, as you were saying. And I think for Nevelson, you know, I mean, we always have to kind of take her quotes, you know, maybe with a grain of salt, but that she talked about seeing all the materials on the streets that she felt she could transform. And I think that wood was a sculptural kind of material that she felt she could manipulate in a way. And as you were talking about almost that, Beth, you were talking about that folk and that hand process, but also that sense of reusing materials, I think was really critical to her. And I think her life really spanned that. I talk about in the catalog when she was born, you know, there wasn't the United States government trash service, like, you know, that didn't start till the 1930s. So reusing goods was part of a lifestyle in the early 20th century, you know. So I think she probably had that foundation as well.
I think you're right. And I think, you know, seeing in the gallery the presence of both the clearly found objects that she painted versus the ones that she had milled or created and then assembled is really amazing. The way it's clearly she's kind of, in a sense, sort of the architecture of it. It's almost as if she had kind of very meticulously planned out like a painting and then enacted it, or, you know, a sort of architecture that, as opposed to something more intuitive. We should draw to a close, but I wanted to acknowledge a few additional questions that sort of relate, that are important. One is the exhibition at the campus gallery or in the downtown gallery? Very important question. It's on the campus at Colby College. Our exhibitions are free and open to all, and please come visit us. We also do now have a downtown gallery, and we will have an additional exhibition. There's a new exhibition at our downtown gallery, and then we will have an additional exhibition opening next week. So it's a good time to see some fresh exhibitions at the Colby Museum and its downtown gallery, which is at the Paul J. Schuff Art Center. And then the same visitor, the same guest, asks about the absence of human form in Nevelson's work. Well, in our exhibition at Colby, you can actually see the human form in some of the paintings that she gave to Colby. So there are two that we added to the exhibition. And I think, Shirley, you so persuasively also represent the way that the body is represented in an abstract way, but in the sculpted form as well. So it's something that she carried through from her longtime painting practice before she became fully a sculptor. And then lastly, a question about the relationship between her work to her Judaic life. I think that is another thing that we are exploring through programming with the Center for Small Town Jewish Life. So if you're interested in that question, please also visit our website and see the programs that are there in the interpretation of the exhibition and the experience of it in community. So speaking of community, I want to thank our speakers tonight, Jaime and Shirley. We're so grateful to have had you here and to celebrate this exhibition on the eve of its opening. We're just absolutely thrilled that it will open tomorrow. And it will be on view until June 9th. And as I mentioned, we have additional exhibitions